And you are good to go.
Okay. So ladies, and I don't know if we have any gentlemen, but just in case. This is the class on 14th century veil hemming technique. And it's a very simple technique. It's basically just whip stitch. But in case anybody is not familiar with it, I'm going to show you on the big screen. And the last, yeah, speaker view. That's what we want. Janelle.
Trying to get in.
I just let you in. All right. So this is what we're doing. I made a huge brightly colored example piece so everybody can see. I've just rolled the edge and I'll mute yours. I've just rolled the edge and used a very visible seam. And I'll show you how we do that with my other example piece.
Muted me, so there's no echo.
Yes. So when you're doing this for real, you're going to use white silk thread on white silk. But for practicing, contrast is good. And you're going to take your fabric and pick anywhere on the fabric. It's usually easier to do it at a straight edge. So I do it at one end of a straight edge and go into the curve at that end of the circle. Go into the curve at that end of the straight edge and go around from there. So what you're going to do is you're going to roll the fabric till you've got a nice secure but still small roll. And then you're going to take your needle. Oh, Mistress Columella, can you put me in the big screen so that I can see it? Because that way I can tell what people are seeing.
You should be able to do where it clicks where it's, let me see where it is.
Because right
Spotlight.
now,
Here we go.
there, that's what we need.
Yep, got it.
Okay. Now I can see that you can see things. So I've taken my fabric and I've rolled it between my index finger and my thumb till I've got a nice secure roll there. And then I take my needle and I come in from one end. And if we have any phlebotomists in the class, this is the move that you're doing. So just slide the needle into the roll and come out through the roll. Pull your thread and then take one wrapping stitch right there where your needle came out. And then you probably have to roll it again, just a little bit. Roll it, wrap it around your left index finger or the index finger of your non-dominant hand. Pinch it between your thumb and your tall finger. And just slide the needle along your finger till you can poke it out just on the inside of the roll. So you're not going through the roll, but you're just going around it. And then you do another stitch about 2 millimeters out from that.
So you don't want to actually catch a couple threads of the roll when you're coming out.
Nope, you don't want to, you don't need to. It's actually more secure if you're not catching the roll itself at all.
Oh, okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So everybody can see what I'm doing?
I can.
Okay. This is actually a very fast maneuver. It's much, much easier than the authors of textiles and clothing would have you believe. I have done this walking around an event site just with the extra fabric tucked under my arm. I'm a little twisted around right now because of where I put the camera, but it's a very simple maneuver. Is anybody sewing along with me, or are you just watching? Yay! If anybody's sewing along and you have any kind of questions, then just speak up and ask. That's what I've gotten done already. Let's see if I can.
What thread did you use on the veil you're wearing?
I used a silk sewing thread that I got from either Dharma Trading or Thai Silks. At this point, I couldn't tell you, but it was one of those two.
Okay, but just a regular sewing thread as opposed to like an embroidery thread or something?
Right, yes.
Okay, thank you.
You don't want a huge roll of it. You
Yeah, I
can go
know.
to Vans or any place and get this size spool of Gutermann's or some other brand.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So it's a very simple maneuver. Is anybody sewing along? Oh, we're
Sewing, but I'm actually sewing something else.
okay.
It's very obvious to me what you're doing, and I just didn't know what the stitch was that was used.
Yeah, it's just a basic whip stitch. It's just very small and very even, and then with silk on silk.
I'm interested in knowing what the shape of a veil was.
Well, we're getting into that later. Now, first I'm going to answer a question that I see both Dorian and Tatiana have asked. Were all veils white? And at first, no, at least not as far as we know. But by the 14th century, which is where we're finding this particular veil stitch done on veils, everything that's been pulled out, they have reason to believe was originally white. And in the artwork, the veils are all white. I haven't come across any non-white veils in the High Middle Ages anywhere, but my focus is mostly France. If you're recreating someplace else, like Eastern Europe or outside of Europe someplace, it's entirely possible that you had other color options. I vaguely remember reading about Italian courtesans having to have a different color of veil to signify, that they were courtesans. But you'd have to look that one up because it's only a vague out of my interest. Now, at some point when you're sewing along, you'll need to make a knot. And that's pretty important because you don't want a big ugly knot, messing up this fine edge that if you're doing it this way is not going to be visible at all. So what you do is you take the roll and you unroll it as much as you reasonably can. And then you take a stitch where you go through that roll so that you come out in the roll.
You're going back, from the back to the front into the roll.
Yes, you're wrapping around, you're just not entirely wrapping around properly. And then you take a small stitch, and that can be either in the roll or in what would be part of the roll if you hadn't unrolled it. And you make a regular knot. You have a loop, you put your needle through it, you make the loop go away, and you have another loop, and you put your needle through that, you make that go away, and you're done. Cut that off. Now, if you've made a knot, I'm using 6 strands of embroidery floss, the whole width of it, because I want the example to be very visible. Obviously, if you're doing this for real, you're not using embroidery floss, and you want your thread to be as invisible as possible. So now I have a knot at this end of my thread, and I want to get started so I can finish sewing. And so I make the roll again, and you notice that that last stitch is a little bit loose because you had to have it loose to make the knot. So I roll the roll so that it's nice and neat again. And then I do the phlebotomist thing so that my knot is on the inside. And I make sure that I come up through the roll and past the last 2 or 3 stitches, because that last one is a little loose, the other 2 might get loose, and I want this to be perfect. Darn. So I wrap that again, I neaten it up, and now I follow those 3 stitches right on top of them if I can. And I keep going. And you just keep going until you've gone all the way around your veil, at which point you'll have to make a knot over here as close as possible to the edge. Now, I'm sure everybody's got this. Does anybody not? All right. Oh, and Cynthia, I'm not the lady who did the kitchen at the Lady of the Lakes demo.
You're not. You don't look like
Okay. I'm not sure who did.
that's okay.
So we just had someone come on a little bit ago. So I'm going to continue showing this for just a little bit longer. And then I'm going to show you some veils and how to cut one. Thank you, Catherine. So, and for our people who just came on, this is an example piece. this is the stitch that you do, only this is an example piece. If you're doing it for real, you're doing white thread on white silk. But if you want to see what you're doing, you want contrasting thread on whatever fabric you're using to practice. You roll the edge, wrap it around your finger so that it's nice and stable, and then you do a basic whip stitch. In textiles and clothing, the stitches are approximately 2 millimeters apart, and the roll itself is 1 millimeter across. So it's a very, very fine edge, something you could not get, at least, and not have it come out. If you want it to last, you cannot do this that fine with a hem stitch. And done on silk with silk thread, you have something that barely shows up as being there at all. Now, I have done this stitch with a Roman veil that is full Roman length. Thankfully for that, I just had to do the ends. I didn't do the selvage because what's the point? I've done this on oval veils that are about knee length. I've done it with, and one that's floor length, because why not? I've done it with rectangular veils. And if you notice, every single one of them is in its own plastic bag. If you make your own veils, you will appreciate this. It will keep them from getting tangled up, lost, and you'll be able to look at the bag and figure out, oh, yes, I want the shoulder length one today. Or, no, I want the one that comes down to the floor. That's another long oval. For the shoulder length one, you want a little bit less than a yard. Let me see what size this one is. This one is 60 centimeters by 72 centimeters. And the width is actually the longest, or the width on me is the longest part. This is shorter than this. Usually I have the ovals turned so this is the longer angle. And, oh, we have
A couple of questions on the chat.
Yes, I see that. Would this hem be acceptable for beading? In textiles and clothing, they do not mention any of the veil fragments as having beads on them. It's possible, but in the artwork of the time, I also see no sign of beading. And you are looking at a very fine silk with a very fine edge, so you might be asking for trouble if you put any kind of substantial beading on it. Even something as small as a pony might damage it at some point.
I know there's at least one courtesan painting from the 16th century in Venice that has either small, very small drop spangles or beads or teeny weeny pearls on the edge.
Okay, so that is a completely different culture and time period, but it sounds like there that was done at least for courtesans, which different rules applied to courtesans than for proper ladies. Let's see, how many strands of thread? Well, I answered that for the practice piece. I was using all 6 strands of the embroidery floss. for actual doing the work, I would use one strand. Cleaning the veils. I clean them with a little bit of a delicate detergent in the sink. Then I hang them up to dry and they don't get mangled. Do we have any other questions? Before I move on to how to cut out the curve shape. Okay. Okay. Of course, I have a dog laying right where I was going to move the chair, but we'll do that later.
No, like,
Yeah. So that's okay. He'll move when I get ready to.
Mimi, come here.
So this is a 1 yard veil that currently is rectangular. You can do rectangular veils. They tended to be earlier period. Basically, the Roman rectangles got shortened and made smaller, but they continued being used through the Merovingian and Carolingian eras. But eventually people decided that the oval is more flattering. So a lot of your later veils are ovals of some type or another. But you do still find a few that are rectangles, or at least that appear to be rectangles. It's sometimes hard to tell with just looking at illuminations and such. But since the rectangles do tend to be less flattering, I tend to cut mine into ovals. I'm going to move the camera so you can see how I'm turning this rectangle into an oval. Yes. All right. So now I have my handy cardboard graph and I'm laying out the silk veil with all 4 layers of it piled up and pinned together so that all 4 corners are right here. That way I only have to cut it once, which is very handy. Line up your edges and pin them. And your silk will shift around because it likes to do that. But Once you've got your corner pinned and at least 5 or 6 inches in either direction pinned, you can start marking your curve. And for that, I found that this type of marking pen is your best choice. Line up the corner on the graph and measure out 1, 2, 3 inches up and in, and make a mark. And I'm making it much heavier than I normally would because I'm going to hopefully make it so you can see. Now, from that mark, go down toward the edge and in toward the folded part of the silk. One inch in each direction. And I'll show you a close-up as we get closer. Then go 2 squares closer to the fold and 1 square down closer to the edge. And make a mark. And then you'll reach the edge of the silk and just make a mark where you want to start. And then come up and do that on the other side. So you make a mark. Make a mark. And make a mark. Now, I'm going to put some fabric underneath this so that the blue marks stand out better against the blue board. And then just draw a line connecting the marks. So you know where to cut. Is someone asking a question? Okay. Now, I'm going to put this down so that you can see better. And you can see the mark right there. There's the other mark. And make a nice curve. And I found that that curve is the most attractive curve that I can make. Okay. So at that point, you just want to pin on both sides of that mark along the entire length of the curve so that nothing shifts when you're cutting, because that is just tragic. And I put the pins very close together Again, so nothing shifts when you're cutting. This is one of those stages where it pays to be slow and precise. Because it's not terribly difficult to cut along a curve, but when you're working with silk, if you make a little mistake, then you might regret it. So a little more time is not a bad thing. So now that I have a row of pins on either side of where I've marked it, I feel secure cutting it because I know that everything's going to be where I want it to be. Yeah. It is possible that if your face has a different shape than mine, or you're working with a different shape of veil than what I'm working with, you might want a different size of curve here. But the method is the same, and I strongly recommend using one of these cardboards because it makes it very easy to see where you want to make your marks. There. Now, if you've ever taken this class with me in person, these are the corners that I give out for you to practice on. And I now have 4 more of them for an in-person class if we ever get to do those again. This veil is ready to go back in its baggie and get sewn as soon as I finish the one that I'm working on right now. Let me turn this up so I can see what. Okay. And what was that? I heard my name. Ah, yes, the washable blue pen. This one I got probably at Joann's. It might have been Michael's or Walmart. Yes. I've tried using marking pencils, but they mess up the edge of the silk and I don't want to do that. I'm not sure, is Frixion a brand?
Yeah.
Okay.
It disappears when heat applied or you apply friction.
Okay. I would tend to go with something that's water soluble or that just dissipates over 24 hours or so. Because I'm going to be treating my veils gently and I don't want to worry about whether I'm treating them too gently for enough heat to be applied or something. And I also don't tend to iron my veils. I just hang them up to dry and that makes them crisp enough. Okay. And yes, for the 14th century and at least as far back as the 12th century and until the end of the Middle Ages, unless you were in a specific category like a courtesan, your veils were white. Ooh. Yeah, I would not want the mark to reappear in cold, especially if I accidentally oops and made a mark where I didn't want it. So now for the rest of our time, I can work on the veil that I'm currently working on. Yes, you can do this on handkerchief linen. I like silk better, it's me personally, but I was rather impressed. This is 12-ounce linen. This is actually 10. This is 10-ounce linen, pretty substantial, practically fighter garb material, and I could still do the roll really easily. Thank you. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them. I'm just going to continue working on my veil. As soon as I put this one back in its baggie so it doesn't get damaged. One other thing to keep in mind, I have used hairspray to make sure that the edges don't unravel. But then I realized that the only times they were getting out of the bag at all was when I was sewing them. So I decided that the hairspray was unnecessary, and since I stopped using it, it still works just fine. There's no noticeable unraveling when I'm sewing the veil, and once I sew it, there's no noticeable raveling at all. I don't think I've mentioned it yet, but my favorite choice for silk is dharmatrading.com. You can get it in several different weights. You can get it in several different weights, from the habitoy to gauze, which I love the 3-mom gauze. I'm even going to be making some heavier silk veils for wintertime. And that will be very handy because as long as we're doing this COVID thing, we might need face coverings. And I can pull a wimple up. Well, my way of making a wimple is to fold a veil in half. And if I wrap the wimple here, it's a wimple. If I wrap it here, it's a face covering. So it'll be that little extra bit of protection. Well, the silk that I purchased to make the winter veils is a 12 mom silk twill. It's also from Dharma Trading. I got the sample and played with it and decided that it would work nicely. And since the way I do veils in the wintertime is I've taken long over and I wrap it. I can show you. Let's see. Take this one off. I prefer a long oval veil for this. Oh, that's one of the new ones. I haven't hemmed it yet. Okay. So I take a long oval and I fold it in half along the length. This one's folded half along the width still, but I fold it along the length. And then take one end, put it over my head, generally down to about the chin. Then I wrap it. Up and over. And voila, wimple. Just making sure that it's exactly where I want it. Do I have enough hair showing, whatever. And then I take another round or oval, or even the one that I was just wearing. And put that over. And as you can imagine, thank you. As you can imagine, put this back on so that it stays in place. As you can imagine, if I did this with 12 mom silk, I'd be nice and toasty. Even with the gauze, I can feel a noticeable temperature difference. So, very, very covered right here. Right. Do we have any other questions? Let's see, 12:48. So I think we're almost out of time. If we don't have,
Yeah, 7 minutes.
okay, 7 minutes, that's perfect. For a veil that's long enough to wear as a wimple, I would recommend 2 yards, maybe a little less, maybe a little more. I think the shortest one that I have successfully worn as a wimple was 1.5 yards. Yes, thank you, Janelle, for answering that. Yes. The mom is a unit of mass so that you can tell how heavy a particular weave is. And the silk that I'm working with today is a 3 mom gauze. You can see with one layer, it's practically invisible. And face covering, except I would wrap it so that it's tighter up top. I've actually done that when it was miserably cold out, and yes, silk pillowcases would be nice. But the heavier the silk is, the more insulation you notice that it gives you. Silk is a really interesting fiber. and that it's very lightweight, it's very comfortable in hot weather, but it's also, it has really, really good insulative properties. It's, well, the Mongolians wore silk coats for a reason, and it wasn't because they wanted to look good, although that might have been part of it. It was very warm. And even today in China, I believe, they use loose silk as batting in a lot of more traditional makes of coats because it's warm. So it's like a wonder fiber. And you're very welcome. And I hope everybody makes some new veils.
All right. Well, I think if that's okay with you, I'll stop the recording now. People can hang out and ask questions, but I'll end the recording.
I think we've even finished with